at a literary princess. If you are new here, welcome. I am a fifth-year PhD candidate in English literature with a focus on Victorian women novelists. And as you might imagine, I like to read, and I like to talk about what I'm reading and what other people are reading. So today I have for you another installment of my What Did I Read in My PhD in English Literature series, where I am going through each of my courses and talking about the different books I read and the papers that I wrote. So we are now up to the spring of my second year. So this was spring 2021. And this course is called National Space in Early Republican and Antebellum Writings, or as we shortened it to, 19th century American literature. So this course was covering from the years 1790 to 1865, specifically looking at space, buildings, architecture. And this was actually the second course that I took that had a focus like this. If you watched my Victorian Gothic video, we also focused on space in the Victorian Gothic novel. So, I really liked this class. It was a good one. I'm not an American literature person. Like, I'm always like, I hate American literature. I don't actually. I hate some American literature, and we'll be talking about that. Mainly, I just had a bad experience with American literature, but you know, hey, I actually really enjoyed this class though. I wish that it hadn't been over Zoom. It would have been so much more fun in person, but the professor is so knowledgeable, and she arranged lots of guest speakers to come in and talk with us, which was a lot of fun. So, let's jump in. Each of our classes were kind of themed around an idea that the main novel we read related to. We also had a lot of secondary readings. I'm not going to go into them much except for the ones that I specifically wrote on. We had for this class 2 short papers that needed to connect secondary readings to primary readings, a presentation, a midterm paper, and a final paper. So I will talk about each of those as they come up. So the first class was titled Virtue and Contagion, Urban, Rural, and Epidemiological Space in the Early Republic. And for this, we read Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown. This was the... This is such a weird book. I don't remember it very well. I heavily skimmed it. There was a whole drama with my copy that was supposed to be coming from the bookstore, and the bookstore said it came in, but then they were like, oh no, it's on back order and won't be in for months. I had to drive in a snowstorm to try to pick it up. It was insanity. It was insanity. So my memory of this book is just all over the place. I had to skim it heavily to get it read in time. But this takes place in Philadelphia in 1793 during the yellow fever epidemic. And honestly, another reason that I kind of don't remember this one and was not really paying attention to was because, you know, we were still in COVID. We're still in COVID, technically. But I was so done. I was like, anything with epidemic, plague, pandemic, I don't want to talk about it. I am zoned out. Leave me alone. So there was a bit of that. But this book is also just really bizarre. And I mean, the first sentence of the little blurb on Goodreads is, Arthur Mervyn has long puzzled students and scholars with its seeming diffuseness resulting from its original serial publication. It's just a weird book. It follows a guy named Arthur Mervyn. I could not tell you what he does other than wander around Philadelphia during an epidemic. I do remember this one scene of him, like, having gone into some person's room at an inn when he was not supposed to be there, and he, like, hides while the people are talking, and then to get out quietly, he, like, leaves his shoes. I don't know. This was wild. I'm like, I should reread this at some point because I'm like, was that real? Because it was just so weird. But yeah, I'm gonna be honest, I very little memory of this one. I gave it 3 stars, which is what I usually do when I heavily skim something. So the next class I was much more attentive to, and this was on gender, race, and frontier in the historical romance. And for this we read Hope Leslie, or Early Times in the Massachusetts. The Massachusetts, not the Massachusetts colony, the Massachusetts. And that's by Catherine Maria Sedgwick. I really enjoyed this one. I'm pretty sure I gave it 4 stars. This is kind of about 2 young women. One is the title character, Hope Leslie, who is a young Puritan woman. This takes place in 1600s, so kind of settling the Massachusetts colony. And the Puritans are in conflict with the native tribe of the Pequots, I believe. And so we have Hope Leslie, and then we also have Magawiska, who is the daughter of the Pequot chief, and is the best character in this book, despite there is like kind of like the noble savage trope going on here, but she's also just a really awesome character and I loved her. And they are fighting kind of for justice for the native people. I'm trying to remember what else happens in this book. I don't remember. But the back of it says that it challenges the conventional view of Indians. Come on, Penguin. Tackling interracial marriage and cross-cultural friendship, and claims for women their rightful place in history. And Hope Leslie is a spirited thinker in a repressive Puritan society who fights for justice for the Indians and asserts the independence of women. Magawiska braves her father's wrath to save a white man and risks her freedom to reunite Hope with her long-lost sister, captured as a child by the Pequots. So yes, I did really like this one. It's slow in parts, but really I just like a good book by a woman writer with female characters. And like I said, I really liked Magawiska. There are tons of problems in this book, but ultimately I did enjoy it. So the next class was on rural housing and millennial housekeeping, home as national space. And for this, we read pieces of 2 different books. The first was The Architecture of Country Houses by Downing is the last name. Hold on, let me. Andrew Jackson Downing, which was published in 1850. And it has like all these blueprints for the houses. It's super cool. And the other book was A Treatise on Domestic Economy by Catherine Beecher, sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it doesn't say the publication date on this one on Goodreads. So I actually presented on this day, and I presented on A Treatise on Domestic Economy. And this was so interesting. This was such an interesting book because on one hand, some of the advice, because this was also talking about like building houses, and some of the advice was so sound, and I was like, yes, girl, like completely on board with everything. And then she just would come out with some truly bizarre things that I was like, girl, no. But one of her main purposes with this book is to establish a national American identity, and she bases that on equality. She has this image of America as a country where men and women are equal. She doesn't talk about slavery, if you're wondering. We just skip that part completely. Like, there was actually a part where I was like, is this satire? I had to Google it. I was like, is this for real? Is she being real right now? Because she's talking about how, oh, it's open to all classes, everyone is equal. I'm like, girl, no. And she contrasts that with European countries that she is saying are like not as equal. And yeah, it was kind of wild. But so I was looking at for this presentation, like, okay, is her idea of the construction of houses, does designs reflect this equality? And they kind of do. Like the space is very female coded in all these houses. There's like maybe one spot for like the men to have their library, but like the rest of it's like parlors, nurseries, kitchen, etc. And this is a big contrast to the English country houses, which we took a look at in a secondary reading called Gendered Space by Daphne Spain. And I actually, in addition to doing my presentation, I wrote one of my short papers on the secondary sources connecting gendered space with a treatise for domestic economy. But it was a super interesting read. And again, there were things that I was completely agreed with. Specifically, she was like, all houses should be built in a square with the fireplace at the center, and then, you know, it heats really well. And I actually see this in my parents' house, which I think was built in 1900, so half a century after this book was published. But the original house is a square, and the fireplace would have been like at the middle. And then there was an addition at some point on either end of the house, adding like a room on either end. And those rooms, even today, they get so cold. I'm like, yes, girl, square house, yes, better for heating, absolutely. And then the other thing that I really liked that she said was that the parlor, the kitchen, and the nursery should all be on the same floor because the woman of the house doesn't want to be walking up and down stairs multiple times all day to be going from the kitchen to make sure everything's going right in there, to the nursery to check on her children, to the parlor where she's spending her free time. Like, nobody wants to do that. Just put it all on the same floor. I was like, yes, because when you look at the English country house architecture and their floor plans, it's like, first of all, there's like 3 floors to go to. And like the women's boudoir is up here, and then there's their parlor down over here. The kitchen's like way down here. It's insanity. I'm like, I don't want to walk through all that. No, all on the same floor. Yes. So, I don't know. I really liked that. And then also talking about the placement of wells and how it should be close to the kitchen and the door for the kitchen, so we're not lugging water up and down a hill or some crap. And also comfort for the domestic servants. She was like, make their areas comfortable, because otherwise they're not going to want to work for you. So in some ways I was like, yes. And then she was like, yes, this country is entirely a country of equality. It was, no. So in my paper on gendered space and a treatise for domestic economy, I was talking about how we move from the very segregated gender spaces of the British country house to the more shared spaces of the American houses, where, you know, the men aren't going off to the smoking room, they're expected to spend time in the parlor with their families, but also how it does show a further divide of the public and private spheres, because now the men go out of the house to work, and so the house just becomes almost a female space. So, this wasn't even a novel, and I somehow got really into it. Anyway, sorry. I'll stop my rant on a treatise on domestic economy. Next class was titled Urban Flaneurs and Pastoral Utopias, and for this we were reading the Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This was my second Hawthorne novel, but I've read quite a few of his short stories as well. Obviously, the other novel is The Scarlet Letter. And this follows a guy whose name I straight up don't remember, but him and a bunch of other people are kind of going to form this utopia community at a farm called Blithedale. This was something people actually did. Nathaniel Hawthorne actually lived on one called Brook Farm. It was an experiment socialist community. Like, people were doing this. Okay. okay? And it's based very much in like the idealized country space versus the like kind of sickly, not good for you urban space. And there is a woman in here called Zenobia who was a great character. And I did really like this book. I gave this one 4 stars. Our midterm paper did have to be on this. So I wrote about the utopia aspect and how Blithedale is actually a failed community in my eyes, because by aspiring to this utopian ideal based on the Garden of Eden, that's not a real community. It's a fake community. The only thing it could do was fail, because the Garden of Eden fails. And so basically my argument was that Hawthorne is saying here, instead of trying to look backward to the pre-fall of man world with the Garden of Eden, we need to be looking forward, and that forward is the modern urban city. So rather than the country being this healthy, wonderful, idealized space, it can only fail, and we need to move forward into the city. So that was my paper on this. I really enjoyed writing this paper. I do remember being like, why do I have to write the paper? I already thought of it. But I think that about all papers. I think I only remember that because I made a Tumblr post about it. But I did use some of the scholarly sources we'd been looking at in classes about these utopian communities. We were required to use a certain number of sources from the class. But yeah, really good book. Very short. Wish I could remember the main character's name. Coverdale. Yeah, okay. It's in the first sentence of my... Yeah, there's kind of a love shape with Coverdale, Hollingsworth, Zenobia, and then another woman whose name I'm not remembering. But yes, good book, highly recommend. So our class after that was titled A Discussion of Spatial Theory and Literary Criticism. And so we didn't read a novel for this because this was the week the paper was due. So we were looking at critical works by Foucault, Lefebvre, Desserteau, and a few others. I'm not going to talk about those because I don't like them much. I'm not a theory girl. I hate Foucault. But yeah, we reviewed some of the things that we had looked over before, including the Daphne Spain piece, which I did like. And then we looked at some new ones as well. And then after that, we moved on to a class on white abolitionist fiction, traversing the nation, redeeming the nation. And for this, of course, we could not have this period without it. We had Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This was my second time reading this. I read it for the first time in high school as summer reading for a history class. Why? So I have very complicated feelings on this book because there are certain parts that I like, and I'll be talking about one of those with my final paper. But also, it's pretty uncomfortable. It's way too long, and it's like almost 2 separate stories that Stowe just like combines at the end through the most obnoxiously convenient, sentimental thing you possibly could. And I'm like, no, stop. That's too much even for me. And I read sensation fiction and other sentimental books all the time. I was like, no. So this follows 2 enslaved people. The first is Tom, who is sold by his original enslavers to somebody else, and he travels south. So I think they start in Missouri. It's not going to tell me on the back. That would be useful. it starts somewhere more the mid, like where the North and the South met, and Tom travels down until he's eventually in Louisiana at the plantation of Simon Legree, who is the worst person ever. And then we also have Eliza, who starts at the same plantation as Tom, but when she hears that her enslavers are going to sell her young son, she decides she's going to run away north with her child. So we kind of have these two contrasting journeys, one north, one south, and everything they encounter. So from that perspective, it's really interesting. However, the stories of Tom and Eliza are so separate that it's kind of like, just make it a separate book. But yeah, so I can't remember how many stars I gave this. It was either 3 or 2. I'm leaning more toward 3 because I don't think I hated it so much as to give it a 2. But it is very long. There are some really uncomfortable things here. And yeah. So I wrote 2 papers on this. I wrote one of my short secondary source papers on Uncle Tom's Cabin and the book Back of the Big House, The Architecture of Plantation Slavery by John Michael Vlach. Let me get a picture up here. So in Back of the Big House, Vlach is talking about how enslaved people would try to kind of regain autonomy slightly by making spaces of the plantation their own. And we actually see a really good example of that in Uncle Tom's Cabin with the character of Dinah, who is a cook for the St. Clair family, who at one point buys Tom. And Dinah has her kitchen exactly how she wants it. She knows where everything is. She says, I like to have my things handy. To anybody else, this kitchen looks like absolute chaos. And there's a character, Miss Ophelia, and I'm forgetting how she's related to the St. Clairs, but she's some kind of relative. And she has come from the North, so she doesn't agree with slavery. But she's disgusted by the state of the kitchen. She's like, it leads to such waste. Like, where's the economy? Like, we're just wasting things, wasting food, wasting money. And she's trying to put it to rights. And Dinah is like, please don't touch my stuff. And this is because Dinah is using this kitchen and having it organized her way as a form of taking ownership and having some autonomy, even in an enslaved state. So Miss Ophelia trying to organize the kitchen the way she thinks it should be is really her trying to restore the order of slavery and establish white dominance in a space that has become a black space because Dinah has created it so. And she's a threat to Dinah's individual identity because Dinah is asserting that identity and her autonomy and her right as I'm a person by having this kitchen set up so that only she can know what's going on. And the St. Clairs, they like steer clear. The Mr. St. Clair is like, I don't want to go in there, much less I, feel differently about the food after seeing it. His wife is like, no, too much effort. And it was super interesting because Vulch gives an example of a cook that did the exact same thing, who rules supreme, as Stowe says of Dinah, and actually kicked the young miss of the house out of the kitchen because she was in the way and causing problems. She was just like, nope, get out of my kitchen, which relatable. So I found this all super interesting, and I didn't enjoy the book, but I did enjoy writing this paper on it. there were pieces of the book that I found really interesting to analyze. And we will talk about another one of those with my final paper in a minute. So the next class was on fugitive slave narratives and environmental justice criticism. For this, we read The Life and Adventures of Henry Bibb, an American Slave by Henry Bibb. I'm gonna be honest, I don't remember a lot of this one. And I think that's probably because we were just coming off of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a chunker. And I was probably a bit burned out. So I'm sorry, I don't remember this one. Henry Bibb was an enslaved person who tried to run away multiple times, starting at the age of 10, according to the summary here. And I do actually remember some of that now. And then he eventually escaped and settled in Michigan and joined the anti-slavery movement. He wrote this book. He was a lecturer and a really important guy in the movement and really interesting. Oh, and then he was working to free his wife and child. Okay, it's like coming back slowly. So I remember this one being really interesting. I just don't remember a lot about it in detail like I do some of the others. Our next class was on white middle-class women, authorship, and the city, and for this we read Ruth Hall by Fanny Fern. This is a semi-autobiographical novel, it's a largely autobiographical novel, about a woman who becomes a writer to support her children after the death of her husband. So, in hindsight, this is super interesting to me. I did really enjoy it at the time, but I think I had already settled on my final paper topic, so I wasn't paying as close attention as I might have. I am actually thinking of including this in my next big project after my dissertation, because yes, I'm already thinking about that, on women writers depicting women writers in their novels. And I'm thinking about making that a transatlantic project, so I would be looking at Ruth Hall in it. But yeah, this was really good. It's kind of oddly structured because she was a newspaper writer. So it's not entirely written the way you think a normal novel would be written. Like, it's kind of sparse on some of the descriptions and things you would expect there to be. But I really enjoyed having a conversation about it. I definitely want to reread it. And then our last class was on urban space, capital space, London, New York, and Washington. And for this, we actually had a bunch of different small things, including Edgar Allan Poe's The Man of the Crowd, Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, and Walt Whitman's Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, along with a few others, but those are kind of the notable ones. And I read Bartleby the Scrivener multiple times before. I prefer not to, is kind of how I feel about having to reread Bartleby the Scrivener every time I have to reread it. Not that I don't like it, but that we always do it. Man of the Crowd, I don't remember much of. Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, I know I've read multiple times before as well. I generally like Walt Whitman as a poet, which is weird for me to say because I don't like poetry. But yeah, so that was the end of the actual classes that we had, and then I had my final paper, which was on Uncle Tom's Cabin. So what I was writing about for Uncle Tom's Cabin was a very specific episode that takes place on Legree's plantation that involves the character Cassie, who's an enslaved woman who is like the best character in this book. So what happens is Legree buys another enslaved woman, Emmeline, because he's a degenerate. Sexually abuse. He has previously done this to Cassie. So the setup kind of becomes like this very gothic setup, and the plantation is coded as gothic. And you would expect, okay, we've got villainous man in charge of the whole place, helpless heroine Emmeline, and then this kind of haunting madwoman, Cassie. Who's this sounding like? Oh, it sounds like Jane Eyre a bit. And I actually talk about that. So I'm looking at the influence of the Gothic on Stowe and how she actually subverts those Gothic tropes. Because in the end, Cassie and Emmeline pair up to escape, and they turn Legree into the person being haunted and tortured. And they create in this attic that is supposed to be this place of fear because an enslaved woman died up there. They create this cozy domestic space for them to hide out until they have a chance to run away. I argue that the merging of the Gothic and domesticity destroys Legree's control over his plantation and gives Cassie the power instead. However, it's kind of undercut because Stowe is always drawing attention to the fact that the ghost story, because there is a ghost story, is not real. We are ultimately left with the idea that while in this moment the dynamic is turned and the enslaved woman becomes the one in control, it's just gonna revert back after she's gone. Even though Legree is dead, it's still going to revert back, and the rest of the enslaved people are going to be sold to other enslavers. And while things change for Cassie and Emmeline, it does not change for other people. So I had a lot of fun with this paper because I love Gothic, obviously. And I was really kind of doing a transatlantic approach of how Stowe is drawing on this very British genre, and specifically in conversation with Jane Eyre, because the chapter that kind of culminates this episode, called An Authentic Ghost Story, there are a lot of similarities to the scene where Bertha Mason goes into Jane Eyre's room and rips up her wedding veil. So I was looking at that. I was looking at how Stowe is subverting the usual Gothic tropes of the man who's in charge, who has his keys and is able to lock women away. There's a great scene where Cassie just slams and locks a door in his face. It's great. It's great. Like, honestly, I think the book is worth reading just for Cassie because this part is so interesting. Like, yes, you have to wade through a lot to get to it because it really doesn't happen till the end, but I do like this episode a lot. So I had a lot of fun with this paper. I got a very good grade on it. My professor really liked it. And yeah, I was just happy to get to write about Gothic and talk a bit about Jane Eyre and kind of the subversion of this mad woman in the attic trope. So that is my 19th century American literature course. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you read any of these books? What did you think? What did you read in your own 19th century American literature courses? If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more of my bookish content. It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.